have a cousin. She was in the car with another of my cousin. They were driving. My cousin, let's call her Kay, was driving along. A police officer pulled them over. Kay didn't have her driver's license when the police officer asked for it, so instead pulled out a makeup compact mirror and handed it to the police officer, who then took the mirror and said, "Oh, I didn't know you were a police officer," gave the mirror back, got in her car, and drove away, leaving my two cousins just kind of confused. This is a pretty bizarre story that my cousin, we'll call her Jay, who is in the car with Kay, told me. It's kind of hard to believe because police officers wouldn't do that normally. But I have no reason to doubt this story, but I wasn't there to vet it with my own eyes.
Similarly, I kind of have a story that was told to me by a family member, and I wasn't present for it, but I kind of believe it at face value. My grandmother tells me a lot of stories about my dad, my uncle, and my aunt from when they were younger. They're always really entertaining. There was one that I remember about how one day my grandmother was like going to put away clothes in my dad and uncle's room. They shared a room at the time. And when she opened their closet door, she saw a stop sign, which had been stolen from the street. And still to this day, she doesn't know who did it because neither of them would admit to being the one to take it, because I couldn't imagine either of them really doing that. But it's just kind of a story that I believe because I believe what my grandmother says, and you know, it's something that I don't know how much of it is completely true, but it's a fun story either way.
These two stories bring us to some of the themes that are talked about in the things they carried, such as the chapter How to Tell a True War Story.
Tim O'Brien talks a lot about what is the meaning of truth and how to know if a story is really true, because in the moment of experiencing something, what you think is reality isn't always so. It can be changed by time, changed by things you didn't see in the moment, and sometimes when you recount an event, even if you were there and even if you try to tell exactly what happens, sometimes details are lost or added.
Like if you were to see a picture from your childhood, you can't exactly remember that day in full, but you remember kind of what is being told you in that picture.
Something that is very similar to the stories that we just told, where we weren't there for it, but a family member told us that and we believed it. How in the things they carry, Tim often talks about how fellow soldiers will tell him stories of things he didn't experience and he wasn't there for, but they want him to believe it anyways. So there's the part where Rat talks about Marianne Bell and about how she came to Vietnam and completely changed as she experienced the war and everything going on around her. Tim expressed that he was very skeptical of the story, even though everyone was telling him he should believe it anyways.
The main reason he was skeptical of this story was that Rat wanted him to believe it so much. Every now and then he'd just keep checking in while he was telling the story saying, "Do you believe me? Do you believe it? Believe me, this happened," because it's too crazy for someone just to have made up.
The other stories that were told, some soldiers were talking about people who went up to the mountain and they were hearing voices and they heard something like a party going on. And Tim O'Brien talks about how sometimes the craziest stories are the most true because you cannot make the things up, even if they seem impossible. There's another thing with the theme of truth of how Tim O'Brien writes his stories in general, where he's basing it off things he experienced, but in order to get the audience to feel the true emotions that he felt in that moment, he tells fictional stories.
That's why the book, The Things They Carried, is marked as fiction.
Something that he actually talked about in his interview was about how he made up the fact that he has a daughter. He said multiple times in Things They Carried that he did. He made this character up so that she could ask him if he'd ever killed someone in the war.
She would ask inappropriate yet innocent questions that no adult would ever think to ask someone, even if they were necessary for the development of that person's own feelings towards what they have experienced.
He talked in the chapter, The Man I Killed, in great detail about how he shot this man, and then he goes on to describe the body and describes the life that this man had before the war and how he didn't want to go to war, but he didn't want to disappoint his village. And in the interview, he said that he made all that up and it was based off of his war experiences and how he felt guilt. For even though he didn't know for sure that a bullet that he shot killed someone, he still felt guilty for his actions in serving in the war and also his inaction of saving people.
He was projecting himself upon the man that he could have killed.
There's also an interesting element that comes with talking about if a story can be 100% true, that comes from everyone who experiences an event will experience it differently. The perspectives of each person do matter, even when we tell our own stories.
From where people have come from in their lives, what they have grown up around, what they have seen, it all shapes their perspective in a certain event that is happening. Everyone's perspective is different. You cannot assume one person's perspective is going to be the same as your own. So that also creates a truth in a storytelling. One person's truth is different for another person. They may see this as something happy or have something that has shaped it into a very tragic memory.